I call Sue Williams-Seo.
Mr. Speaker, earlier tonight in the Legislative Council chambers, I joined with my Labour Party colleagues and other members of the opposition to welcome representatives of families of the workers who died in work-related accidents in the last 5 years, including those who died in the Pike River tragedy. And I want to acknowledge them, sir. One of the questions that the Speaker raised there was that they were promised by this government and by this Prime Minister that legislation will come into this House that would ensure protection for all workers. And they feel, sir, that that promise has not been kept.
That's not part of this.
I raise that, sir, because that's the question that New Zealanders need to ask of this government when they listen to their speeches on this particular bill. In the promises that they are making, that this bill will enable more social community providers to provide more social housing. That's what they are promising New Zealanders. That under this bill, by selling off state houses, that more social housing is to be provided to New Zealanders. We have heard tonight, sir, that the Minister made that promise by saying that this bill gives her and another minister exclusive powers to sell thousands of the current housing stock to the private sector. Now, they say community housing providers, but we know that that's not what's intended to say. They've not been straight with New Zealanders. When they use the word community housing providers, we think it's going to be the Salvation Army, but that's not true. We think it's going to be the Methodist Mission, but that's not true. What is true is that they have been talking to the property investors not only in New Zealand, but also in Australia. So when they say community housing providers, it is the property investors that they intend to sell these houses to. So I ask New Zealanders, as they listen to this, remember the promise that was given to the Pike River families and ask themselves, can they trust this government in the same similar promises that they now make to New Zealanders in regard to the provision of social housing? So in the regulatory impact statement of this House, this will give listeners a bit of an idea about the incompetency of this government. In the regulatory impact statement, it says, this proposal has been prepared in a short time frame. They have been prepared without precise information about the form of the transfers transactions and the New Zealand Housing Corp's future role in the social housing market. The future of the social housing market under this government's legislation is they are going to destroy Housing New Zealand as we know it. They are destroying a tradition that has existed since 1905, when from thenceforward the government of the time and subsequent governments agreed that there was a right for every new citizen of this country to be housed. It was a basic fundamental right. That right, sir, is enshrined in international covenants. Subsequent governments have upheld that. In 1970, sir, we continued under Labour government the provision of social housing because of that belief that it was a basic and fundamental right that every New Zealander should be housed in a house that was affordable, in a house that was warm, in a house that was safe for families. What does a Conservative government who has existed, so what has been their attitude towards the provision of social housing? As far as we go back, every time there's been a Conservative government that has come into power, it is their belief that they sell off state housing. It is their belief that the private sector should rule. And the same happened also in the 1990s, when the former national government also did the same. But this government now is going to go further. So what are they going to do? They'll give the ministers, Bennett and Mr. English, the power, exclusive powers, to sell off state houses. Who will they sell it to? Here's how they say it is part of a strategy, their social reform strategy. If you look at the first point that they make, they establish the Ministry of Social Development as the single purchaser of social housing. What does that mean? No longer will you have Housing New Zealand providing social housing. In the second point, they say growing community housing providers through MSD's contracting and selling of Housing New Zealand Corporation stock. What does that mean? They're going to sell off the housing stock to property investors. Third point, making income-related rent subsidies available to non-government CHPs to help those providers to grow. What does that mean? They are going to subsidise landlords and property investors to provide this particular service. And the final part that they say this legislation provide is housing more families by making better use of housing corporate land. What does that mean? They're selling off land that are currently owned by Housing New Zealand into the private sector. But sir, this is what the disclosure statement says, prepared by Treasury. This legislation is unprecedented. Sir, this is new powers that they are giving their minister, because not only do the ministers are accountable to Housing New Zealand or the board, they're only accountable to themselves. Where does the money go when selling the stock and in selling the land that belongs to Housing New Zealand? It does not go back to the Housing Corporate Board. It goes into the Crown entity's bank account. What does it get used for? Certainly it doesn't indicate anything about the provision of more social housing. So, sir, they've not been straight with New Zealanders when they introduced this legislation. And that's why I said, sir, the promise that they make to the Pike River families is a similar promise that they're making today to New Zealanders, and people need to be asking themselves whether they can trust this government to keep their word. I say no. I say if you base it on their track record so far, there is no way that selling of state houses will ensure that there's greater provision of social housing to those in need. One of their members at least acknowledged that there is a role by the state in the provision of this. But once a state house is sold with a tenant to the private sector, do we imagine that the landlord is going to fix up the heater when it breaks down? Do we imagine that the landlord is going to replace the carpet if it's ruined? Do we imagine that the landlord is going to keep that house warm so that children living in there are free from any sickness and illnesses, sir? If we go by the track record of most landlords, that is not going to happen, based on the complaints that our officers receive. The other day, sir, I was in Botany, the electorate in Botany, and I took Andrew Little there, and we visited the Salvation Army in Howick. Sir, I imagine that when we talk about Howick, it's an affluent part of our society in Manukau. But this is what the Salvation Army said to us. Of all the issues that they are now facing in a wealthy part of South Auckland and Howick, housing is the number 2 after loneliness of that generally elder population. And they are now seeing, sir, more and more people being housed in situations where they are renting a garage that does not have insulation, does not have any warmth. They also said, sir, that they are surprised by the number of people who are now in homeless situations where the Salvation Army is having to find homes. So that's the kind of condition that this government has established for New Zealand in the last 7 years. And they will continue along that pathway, sir, based on this legislation. Yes, they can say all they want about helping the poor, but this piece of legislation doesn't. I want to finally finish off, sir. Most of us would have campaigned and have walked around and at one time or another would have stood on dog taka, sir. And if you imagine standing on that, we've often had that experience trying to clean it off. It doesn't go away, sir. It stays. And I would say, sir, that when this government passes this piece of legislation, that New Zealanders will forever remember it is this government that are selling off Housing Corp, and the stench is going to stick with them forever. I want to finally say, farmers will appreciate this, but the farmers have a saying, sir, does not matter how much perfume you pour on pig shit, it still stinks. And that's what, despite their flowery words, this piece of legislation will hurt ordinary New Zealanders.
I call Dr. Pamji Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on the Social Housing Reform Transaction Mandate Bill in its first reading. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to